Okay, this will be a video about Johnny Gosch, who was a 12-year-old boy who went missing in 1982 and has never been found, and Jeff Gannon, who was a White House press reporter in the early 2000s that some people claimed was actually Johnny Gosch. This is a really strange, winding story. Just to give a quick little overview of what we'll be talking about. So, this is Johnny Gosch. When he was 12, he disappeared on his morning paper route in Des Moines, Iowa, and this is about 40 years ago. He's never been found. There's all sorts of theories and mysteries surrounding his disappearance and what became of him. But, 40 years have passed and he's never been found. His disappearance got linked to this Franklin cover up story, which is just the absolute worst story of child abuse. It was this massive network of people involving kids and some extremely, extremely powerful people. Then the whole thing got covered up and no one was ever really punished. It's a horrible story. We'll get into that a little later. But Johnny Gosch got potentially tied up in this. And then in the early 2000s, 20 some odd years after Johnny Gosch went missing, this guy appeared, Jeff Gannon, and he was a White House press reporter who got caught lying about his credentials and his background. There was this big investigation into him. And many, after they started really looking into him, became convinced that he was actually Johnny Gosch after all these years. And this was called one of the most bizarre stories to ever happen in Washington, D.C. And it probably was. And then this story also has potential links to Hunter S. Thompson. So there's a lot of winding stories and different characters involved. We'll go ahead and get started by talking about Johnny Gosch's 1982 disappearance. So on September 5th, 1982, he went missing in Des Moines, Iowa. He left the house really early, 5 a.m., to deliver papers, and he vanished during his paper route, and he was never seen again. And this is the exact newspaper that he was delivering that Sunday morning. There's something really incredibly strange about this paper and the stories that it was covering that kind of adds another element to this whole bizarre mystery. We will get into that a little bit later, but just remember that there's something really strange about this issue of the newspaper that Johnny Gosch just happened to be delivering on that day. And this Johnny Gosch disappearance really did just turn into a massive, massive story. The whole community got involved in trying to find this little boy and find out what happened to him. There were posters of him everywhere, buttons and pins. Johnny Gosch was one of the first people to have his picture, from one of the first missing children to have his picture on a milk carton. There were all these mysteries and strange things about the morning that he disappeared, and all these reports. There was one report of a blue car that pulled up to him, and the driver started talking with Johnny Gosch. And this happened right before he disappeared. So there was this massive search for the blue car and the identity of the people who were inside. Um, Noreen Gosch, Johnny's mom, claimed that she would get photos like these in the mail and left on her doorstep of just like little kids tied up and bound. She claims Johnny was in a few of these photos. Just really horrible stuff. Noreen Gosch also claimed that Johnny Gosch called home multiple times, pleading for his life and pleading for help from her. There were also tons of reports of sightings of Johnny Gosch throughout the nation, down south, out west, all throughout the nation. There were reports of people who said they'd spotted Johnny Gosch. And then this guy is one of the more controversial people involved in this. His name is Orville Cooney. He was the West Des Moines police chief at the time, headed up the investigation into what happened to Johnny Gosch. And from the start, Noreen Gosch claimed that he was just doing an absolutely terrible job of investigating this, of communicating with her, of following up on leads that she was giving him. And she eventually reached the point where she came to believe that he was purposely doing a bad job, purposely trying to, submarine this investigation because he was protecting someone or protecting a group of people who were involved in this. And this guy, Orville Cooney, he's a really gruff guy. He has this quote on the left there, right in the heart of the investigation. He said, "I really don't give a damn what Noreen Gosch has to say. I really don't give a damn what she thinks. I'm interested in the boy and what we can do to find him. I'm kind of sick of her." It's a pretty heartless thing to say about someone who, just has a son go missing. This guy retired very, very shortly after Johnny Gosch went missing. And then Orville Cooney, he got caught stealing from Target after he had retired from the police department. So that's kind of an interesting thing. The FBI also eventually got involved, and Noreen Gosch also claimed they were just bungling this investigation horribly. And she claimed that their investigation was so bad that she just flat out asked them, like, quit investigating this, quit looking into this. I'm gonna just, do this on my own, hire my own private investigators, and just try to find my son that way. I don't want you to get in my way. And she did hire a whole bunch of private investigators and a whole team of people who kind of like jumped in to help her out. But there's a lot of like mystery surrounding a lot of these people who got involved. This guy, Sam Soda, was one of the private investigators she hired. And eventually she started to believe that he might have actually been involved in her son's kidnapping. On the right there, that's the composite sketch of the man who was driving the blue car that we talked about. And then that's this Sam Soda on the left there. So they do look alike. And so she came to believe that he actually might have been involved and was kind of planted like near her to kind of monitor her and like her, progress into the investigation. Noreen Gosch was also contacted by this guy named Paul Bishop, who said he said he worked for the CIA, and he started telling her about an international kidnapping pornography ring that her son was now involved in. And this Paul Bishop CIA guy, started working with her and like feeding her information and stuff. And then one day he just vanished off the face of the earth. He'd given her a phone number at Langley Air Force Base to contact him. She dialed the phone number. It was dead. Didn't exist anymore. And she never did ever see this Paul Bishop guy again, and never found out what happened to him. And there were all these other strange little things that happened. There was this $1 bill that was found in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and written on the $1 bill that just said, "I am alive, Johnny Gosch." And so somebody just randomly got this bill back at a store. Um, they reported it to the authorities, reported it to Noreen Gosch. Then there was this whole thing about trying to find out where this dollar bill had come from and if it was legit. Noreen Gosch claimed it was legit and it was his handwriting, but they never did, find out where this came from. And then another really strange thing that started happening was a whole bunch of paper boys for the Des Moines Register started kind of being targeted. So this is Eugene Martin, and on August 12th, 1984, which wasn't even 2 years after Johnny Gosch disappeared, this Eugene Martin disappeared. Same story, same circumstances about Johnny Gosch. It was an early morning newspaper route. He left to go deliver newspapers, and then he just never returned home, and has never been found to this day. And again, this was only not even 2 years after Johnny Gosch went missing. And then in the years that followed, there were all these other stories about Des Moines Register newspaper carriers, teenagers who were delivering newspapers in the morning, who were assaulted, chased, grabbed by people. Most of them escaped, but it's, certainly a weird thing that this constantly happened in Des Moines to paper carriers in the morning. And then this whole mystery around the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch got really wild when this guy came forward. His name was Paul Bonacci, and he said he'd been severely abused and trafficked as a child, and trafficked to some very powerful people. And the people who ran this child trafficking ring had forced him to participate in the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch. So he said he was a part as a kid of the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch, and all the things that Paul Bonacci talked about led to this thing, and it's been known as the Franklin cover-up or the Franklin Credit Union scandal. But this is such a horrible case, one of the worst things ever. Basically, there was this credit union in Omaha, Nebraska, a bank, pretty much, the Franklin Credit Union, and it was investigated because there was millions of dollars like missing and being misappropriated. And during this investigation into the missing money, they uncovered links to this massive child trafficking network that was linked to this Franklin Credit Union. And one of the main kind of other places that was linked to it was this place, Boys Town in Nebraska, which was a foster care home for children, an orphanage. It was kind of like a little community for, kids who were orphans. And what was really going on was these kids who were at Boys Town were being abused by priests, were being trafficked around the country to the highest bidder. And Boys Town was just a front for this child trafficking ring. And there were more than 80 kids in just the Omaha, Lincoln area who came forward and told the same stories about being forced into prostitution. And they named some very, very powerful people in Omaha and in the Nebraska area who were a part of this. The Omaha World Herald editor Harold Anderson was named. The police chief, Robert Wadman, was named. And then this Peter Citron was a reporter for the Omaha World Herald. And, obviously the fact that there were these very prominent people for the Omaha World Herald being named as being involved was a big deal, because back then in the 1980s, the Omaha World Herald was the only newspaper for the Omaha area. This was how people got their news. And so if these people who were a part of this were, you know, writers and editors and even the head people at this newspaper, they could distort the news, report on certain things, and cover up things very, very easily. And this guy, Harold Anderson, many of the kids went into graphic detail about what they'd seen him do with other children. This guy, Peter Citron, who was a reporter for the Omaha World Herald, he was accused of things and he denied it. And then years later, in 1990, he actually got sent to prison for sexually assaulting children. So even though he, denied it at the time and said, no way, this isn't true at all, years later down the road, this dude ended up going to prison for sexually assaulting children. And if you look at like the Omaha World Herald reporting on this, I mean, it's just awful. They described this as a hoax. All these children who came forward with these stories, they said there were hoaxes, wild rumors, conspiracy theories. They really did their best to just discredit these children coming forward with these stories. And again, since the Omaha World Herald was the pretty much the only news source for a lot of the people in this area, a lot of them kind of took this at face value and did honestly think this was just a hoax or a conspiracy or whatever. And this wasn't just like a Omaha or like a Nebraska thing. There were major, major links to Washington, D.C. This guy, Larry King, was the guy who ran the Franklin Credit Union, and he was very, very big in the Republican Party in Washington, D.C., had a place in Washington, D.C. Here he is speaking to open the GOP National Convention in 1984. And so he was one of the main kind of conduits between Omaha and Washington, D.C. Then there was this other guy in Washington, D.C. who was a huge, huge part of this. His name was Craig Spence. Now, he was sort of like a lobbyist of sorts. He was very, very connected. This article here, before this all came out, this was like a feature on him. And it says his personal phone book and party guest list constitute a who's who in Congress, government, and journalism. This Craig Spence guy was kind of notorious for throwing these big, lavish parties all the time. And maybe you've seen this newspaper or this headline before. This is a pretty famous headline, and maybe you're familiar with it, but there were groups of teenage male prostitutes who were being given midnight tours of the White House. And it kind of ensnared like President Reagan and Vice President Bush. And, supposedly these were just midnight tour for whatever reason. They were showing up at midnight and giving quote unquote tours of the White House. Uh, some people came forward and alleged that a lot more was going on here with these teenage prostitutes going to the White House at midnight. And anyway, this Craig Spence guy is the guy who kind of was like bringing these kids to the White House to go on these midnight tours. And he also, yeah, like I kind of mentioned, he was notorious for throwing these lavish parties at these really nice places. But one of the big things about this whole Franklin scandal and this whole prostitution thing is that blackmail played a huge, huge part in it. So this Craig Spence said that, he was secretly videotaping people during these parties through a two-way mirror. He was, getting him on camera with sex acts with, people and teenagers that they shouldn't be with. And even Paul Bonacci in his testimony, he talked about how a lot of times these things happen like right around the time that a bill was going to be voted on. If they needed to get something passed through the legislator, he would put some people there against it in a compromising position by using the boys and girls. So they would get people to change their vote by catching them on camera doing something really bad and blackmailing them. And then this Craig Spence, so right as this whole thing was unfolding in 1989, he committed suicide, quote unquote. It's a very strange story. He barricaded himself in a hotel room, and apparently he got really paranoid leading up to this time, and friends were talking about how paranoid he was. And then this particular night, he barricaded himself in a hotel room in Boston, and they found his dead body inside. And it's definitely a very suspicious suicide, especially the timing is definitely suspicious, seeing that it happened right around the time this whole Franklin scandal was emerging. Um, but what ended up happening with the Franklin scandal was there was, 80 some kids who came forward and told stories that were very, very similar. And 78 of them ended up taking back their statements due to murder and threats. There was one kid who had initially come forward. His 21-year-old brother was killed in a car wreck. There were other people who suspiciously died who'd come forward around this time. But there were two people who didn't take back their testimony and who, said their stories were accurate, and they were not going to say that they were lying. Paul Bonacci was one of them. He's the one who said that Johnny Gosch, he'd been forced to participate in Johnny Gosch's kidnapping, and then Johnny Gosch got like brought into this child trafficking ring. And then the other girl was this girl, Alicia Owen. She maintained all along that everything she had talked about and this whole trafficking ring, this actually existed. She wouldn't take back her statement, and she ended up going to jail for perjury. So the two people who, you know, stood by their word, they both ended up being sentenced to prison, and she had a horrible sentence. She spent longer in solitary confinement than any female in the history of Nebraska. So she was really punished for, standing her ground and saying, no, this trafficking ring did exist. I was forced to be a part of it. And she was one of the many ones who was naming these really powerful people who were involved in it. And then even like the grand jury that, took place and sentenced these two to prison, and basically said the whole thing was a hoax. There's like a lot of real mystery around, well, were they, the grand jury, were they covering it up? Were they kind of trying to sabotage the whole thing? This whole Franklin cover up, Franklin Credit Union scandal is an absolutely massive, horrible mystery. This, little summary I just gave only scratches the surface. There's this really good documentary called Conspiracy of Silence. It got banned before it actually aired on TV, but you can find it on YouTube. It's very good. It's very, very sad. And then these two books here both do a really good job of kind of covering the whole thing. I didn't want to go into too much detail on the Franklin scandal because this video would be 9 million hours long if I did, but this is just kind of an overview of it. The point is that after Johnny Gosch had gotten taken, this guy Paul Bonacci came forward and said what had happened to him was he became, kidnapped and got thrown into this whole child trafficking ring that was based out of Omaha. And Omaha, if you don't know, is only a couple hours away from Des Moines, where Johnny Gosch was taken. And the whole Johnny Gosch disappearance pretty much kind of disappeared. That is until about 2005, when the Johnny Gosch disappearance re entered the news in a major way when Gannon Gate happened. And this is so bizarre. So basically, in 2005, there was this reporter here who was constantly attending like White House press conference, and he was always called on by George W. Bush. And this guy's name was Jeff Gannon. He would always ask these really easy softball questions to George Bush. People started to suspect he was like a plant being placed there by the Bush administration to tee up these softball questions so George Bush could answer them. And the thing was, like, no one really knew who he was. He didn't work for like a major newspaper or a major network or anything like that. People had never, like, talked to him or been familiar with him at all. People looked into him and found out he worked at this just random news site called Talon News, which wasn't big at all. No one had ever heard of this. And it got even more suspicious because Talon News didn't even exist when Jeff Gannon initially started appearing at these White House press conferences and asking George Bush questions. So even though he claimed that he, worked for this Talon News site, when he started attending the press conferences, the site didn't exist, so he didn't work for them at all. But where it got really interesting and really wild was people kept looking into kind of his background and trying to figure out who this guy was who was asking George Bush all these softball questions. And they found out that Jeff Gannon used to go by the name Jeff Guckert, and he was a male prostitute on sites like malecorpse.com, workingboys.net, and meetlocalmen.com. He was a gay male prostitute. He went by the name Bulldog, which is an awesome name for a gay male prostitute. And he listed his age as 32 years old. That is significant. We'll talk about that in a bit. But on his profiles, which were from the early 2000s, he listed his age as 32 years old. And as people looked into this, the hot rumor that really started spreading around the internet and really kind of took hold for a moment and really spread like wildfire was that this Jeff Gannon was actually Johnny Gosch, because this Jeff Gannon guy went by all these different names over the course of his life. He was once known as Jeff Guckert. He was known as James Guckert. Then he was known as Jeff Gannon. And you see, every name he used was always JG, Jeff Gannon, James Guckert, Jeff Guckert. And Johnny Gosch was also JG too. And so that was like really the hot rumor for a while, that this Jeff Gannon guy, who had a previous secret life as a gay male prostitute and who was now a reporter asking George Bush questions in the White House, that it was actually Johnny Gosch. And so this really kind of became a big deal for a while. This guy, Ted Gunderson, who had, pretty much devoted his life after he retired from the FBI, he used to work for the FBI, and he pretty much devoted his life to this whole Franklin child trafficking scandal. He really got heavily involved, worked constantly with Noreen Gosch, and he said he was 99% sure that Jeff Gannon was indeed Johnny Gosch. This Ted Gunderson was in constant contact with a lot of the, children who'd been a part of this Franklin trafficking ring, and, who claimed that Johnny Gosch was a part of it too. And he claimed that a lot of these kids still kind of kept in contact with each other. And amongst these, kids who'd been trafficked and abused and whatnot, it was kind of common knowledge that Johnny Gosch had moved on and was now in DC and went by the name Jeff Gannon. And so this was, there were a few mainstream articles. There weren't that many mainstream media articles about these really strange similarities between Jeff Gannon and Johnny Gosch. But there was one really interesting interview that Jeff Gannon gave, and he was kind of grilled a little bit about these similarities between him and Johnny Gosch. But it's a really strange interview. There's a lot of just really bizarre aspects to it. I'll go ahead and play a few clips from the interview right now, and then talk a bit about him right after.
Interview and wanted to come on and chat, and we appreciate that, sir. So, Jeff, here's what Johnny Gosch said on our last show. Let's listen, and then I'm going to ask you to react.
I do not know if Gannon is Johnny or not. Only a DNA test would provide that information conclusively.
Jeff, one question for you. Let's get right to the point. Are you willing to take a DNA test and settle the controversy once and for all? Yes or no?
Absolutely, I would definitely take a DNA test, but that isn't even necessary because there's so much evidence available to disprove these accusations.
That's a yes, then.
Well, he's saying yes. My friend Jeff is saying yes.
As a lawyer, I can smell a
No.
hedge.
You got to understand something. My friend here, Jeff, who's come on our show today, didn't do anybody else's show, he's going to tell us the fact. Jeff, how old are you, first off?
I'm 48 years old.
48 years old. My man Johnny Gosch there would be 35 years old. Lisa,
why
the
are you
numbers.
Avoiding the question?
No. He just said, hey, Jeff, you said you would take a DNA. I could set this whole thing up, but let's get to the point. The point is, by giving a DNA sample, there could be opening up some other avenues of things that I kind of know that you possibly could be involved, and I don't knock it. Again, if you want to go suck on a Johnny Pump or whatever you want to do, you could do in this world. But the point is, all we're here for is to show that my friend Jeff is not Johnny Gosch.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a question, not Bo. Jeff, are you willing to take a DNA test, yes or no? Yes or no?
Yes. When I cut my finger yesterday, there was plenty of DNA available. You should have stopped by.
What else you want, Lisa?
Are you his lawyer?
No, excuse me. He's my friend Jeff down there. Jeff, thank you for coming on the show again. You know what we're doing here? All this conspiracy stuff on the blogs, on all these internets, what we're doing is we're cutting to the chase. Again, I don't understand why, and you said it to me over the phone, and you said that you feel sorry for Noreen. You feel sorry for her missing her son, and you wouldn't put her through if you were her son.
You're
you said you're 40.
In his mouth,
he says he's 40.
Jeff, let's hear from him. Here's my question. Jeff, have you reached out to Noreen? What have you told her?
I have not been in communication with this woman because I can't determine whether some of the emails I'm getting are actually this woman or not. There are hundreds of people that are contacting me about this story. I have no idea who they are. Nameless, faceless people making wild accusations.
Do you have a pen and paper? Because I can give you her phone number right after the show. Bo, are you on a payroll?
No, I'm not on a payroll. But when a guy is falsely accused, you got to stand up for innocent people. You're an attorney. You understand that, too. The man is going to give his DNA. The man is 48 years old. Johnny Gosch would be 35 years old. He looks 48 years old. I'm 54 years old. He looks 48 years old. Why can't the guy be telling the truth?
So clearly that was probably the worst interview of all time. This guy, Bo Dietl, just basically took it over, was putting words into Jeff Gannon's mouth, just totally ruined the whole thing. Like, it's pretty obvious that this Bo Dietl guy was, must have been told to just make this whole thing seem like it's crazy or seem like, it's just been debunked and there's nothing to it at all. His coworker looked like she was ready to strangle him. It's kind of weird how he keeps referring to Jeff Gannon as my friend. He keeps saying my friend Jeff. It's a little strange, but this Dietl and Daniel show was one of the very few times that a major news outlet actually discussed the whole Jeff Gannon, Johnny Gosch controversy. The age thing is always brought up as like something that debunks this whole notion. Jeff Gannon, claims in that interview, he claimed he was 48, and that's way older than Johnny Gosch would be. But according to Bulldog's profile from 2002, Bulldog, who was Jeff Gannon, Bulldog was 32 years old in 2002, which meant that he would be 35 or 36 in 2005 when this Deedle and Daniels interview happened, and 35 or 36 in 2005 is the exact age that Johnny Gosch would have been. So the ages actually do match up if you go by what Jeff Gannon / Jeff Gucker / Johnny Gosch / whatever his name is, if you go by what he put on his online uh, male prostitution profile. And even if you look at this guy, Jeff Gannon, he doesn't look 48 at all in this picture. In 2005, he looks way closer to 35 or 36. And this whole notion of like him having to take a DNA test became kind of a hot topic for a while. That's what Ted Gunderson always said. He said he was 99% sure that Jeff Gannon was Johnny Gosch. The only way he'd be 100% is if he took a DNA test. On that Deedles and Daniels show, that Daniels lady asked him point blank, "Are you going to take a DNA test?" And he said he would. Noreen Gosch at the time said that she had no idea if this was actually Johnny. She thought there was some similarities, but she'd need a DNA test to be 100% sure. And even though Jeff Gannon did agree to take a DNA test in that Deedles and Daniels interview, he never did. And that's always kind of been one of the mysteries, because he could have very, very, very easily, cleared this whole thing up right away if he would have just taken a DNA test like he said he was going to, but he never did. And what really happened with it is just that the major news media really ignored it for the most part. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but that Deedles and Daniels interview was one of the few times where they actually talked about or asked this Jeff Gannon about the whole Johnny Gosch similarities, or this rumor that he was Johnny Gosch. The Gannon Gate thing, I mean, it was kind of featured in newspapers and was kind of popular for a hot minute, but most of them just focused on the fact that, well, how did this former male prostitute get White House press access, and how did he get his press pass, and was this like an issue of like national security, that it had been so easy for him to use a fake name and have no one look into his past and get a press pass? um was that like a national security issue? Like, did the screening process need to be stricter and need to look more closely into people's pasts? And that's really the angle that the major media kind of tackled this from, was the whole issue of this former male prostitute being, reinventing himself as a reporter who now had access to the White House. They didn't really focus at all on whether or not he was Johnny Gosch. And, really the main way this took hold and really became popular was not just on the internet, but also on some of the alternative like newspapers. Some of them featured it, and one of the interesting things that did happen was this City View paper was like the alternative newspaper for Des Moines, and it was really popular. It had a very big audience, and they went hard on investigating this Jeff Gannon, Johnny Gosch thing. They really featured it pretty heavily. And what happened with City View was, the day after they published this Jeff Gannon, Johnny Gosch piece, they were bought out by these two rich guys named Michael Gartner and Gary Gerlach. And Michael Gartner just happened to be the former editor of the Des Moines Register, and Gary Gerlach was the publisher of the Des Moines Register. So these two people with the connection to the Des Moines Register, after this City View alternative newspaper went pretty heavily into looking into this and publicizing this Jeff Gannon, Johnny Gosch similarities, these two people, Michael Gartner and Gary Gerlach, just bought the newspaper, fired practically everyone, and just shut it down completely. And so it's, interesting that these two people who bought City View and totally shut down the newspaper after it started looking into this, how both of these people, Michael Gardner and Gary Gerlach, have connections to the Des Moines Register, which obviously Johnny Gosch worked for the Des Moines Register as a newsboy, and all these other the other paper boy who went missing worked for the Des Moines Register, and a lot of these other paper boys who we talked about earlier, who almost got got taken, they also work for the Des Moines Register. And that kind of brings us to one of the really final strange thing, one of the second to last final strange thing we'll talk about, and it has to do with this issue of the Des Moines Register. This is the Sunday edition that Johnny Gosch was delivering on the day that he was taken. And I mentioned that there's something really bizarre about this issue and the stories that are featured. And right here in the corner, this was one of the main stories on the front page, is that this guy, James Gannon, was named the editor, the head dude of the Register. And it seems so very strange that the name thing, Jeff Gannon is supposedly who Johnny Gosch changed his name to. And then this guy who just happens to take over the Des Moines Register where Johnny Gosch worked is named James Gannon. And it just so happens that the day Johnny Gosch, the newspaper on the day Johnny Gosch was taken, is announcing right here on the front page that this guy is now the new editor. And interestingly, there's another connection too, because something else that was mentioned in this article is that this guy, Gary Gerlach, has become the publisher. Well, Gary Gerlach was the guy who, along with Michael Gardner, bought out this City View alternative newspaper that was looking into the Jeff Gannon, Johnny Gosch similarities, and bought out the City View newspaper and fired everyone and shut it down completely. So it's really strange, these various links of the Des Moines Register to this whole thing. And one interesting thing is that Noreen Gosch always complained about how unfair the local media coverage was to the case. She really thought they did just a terrible job of giving her a fair shake and portraying her in a good light. And she has this quote about just how bad she felt the media coverage was. And she says, "I was afraid to open the newspaper each morning because I didn't know who would be attacking us next. Nor could I understand why. I kept asking this question daily. How could they do this, and what was their motive? Why would Gannon, the editor of the Des Moines Register, encourage and assist in the attacks against parents to find their child?" So the whole thing is pretty strange. And then if you go back and look at the Franklin scandal, the Franklin cover-up, and how the editor of the Omaha paper was accused by multiple children of, being one of the people who was kind of benefiting from this, child trafficking ring. And then there was also this reporter, Peter Citron, who many children, pointed at as well. Peter Citron ended up getting arrested for sexual abuse on a child, on two children, actually, after this whole thing happened. So again, these editors and these reporters of these newspapers, especially back in the 80s, they had so much power because they could just, report on certain facts, ignore other facts. It was how most people got their news, especially their local news. And so the editors of these papers, they were the ones who oversaw everything, and they could, pick and choose what details to include, pick and choose what details to ignore. They really did have a tremendous amount of power. And again, all these links, not only of the James Gannon, the editor of the Register, and Gary Gerlach, and just the coincidence of all these Des Moines, Register paper boys, either getting kidnapped or almost getting kidnapped just in a very short amount of time, just a few years. And then that brings us to the final strange aspect, and it's, one of the stranger aspects of this whole thing, and it has to do with the famous writer Hunter S. Thompson. And so how he gets kind of roped into all this is that Paul Bonacci, when he was giving his testimony, he claimed that in Las Vegas, they one time picked up a man who identified himself as Hunter Thompson. And this Hunter Thompson filmed a snuff film, filmed a really bad, highly illegal film. And so there was that, Paul Bonacci saying there was a Hunter Thompson. I will say that it does seem weird that if they did pick up Hunter Thompson, that he would just give his name as, "Hi, I'm Hunter Thompson, here to direct this horrible film." But this Paul Bonacci did say it was Hunter Thompson. Then this guy, his name was Rusty Nelson. Now, he was the personal photographer for Larry King, who was basically the central character in the whole Franklin Union scandal and the whole Franklin child prostitution ring. This Rusty, this Rusty Nelson was his personal photographer for a while, and he claimed that in 1988, Hunter S. Thompson offered him $100,000 to shoot a snuff film involving a child, and this Rusty Nelson guy turned down the offer. And what's very interesting is right around the whole time that this Jeff Gannon, Johnny Gosch thing surfaced in 2005, Hunter S. Thompson killed himself, quote unquote, committed suicide. And the timing is just, really suspicious. If you look into the fact that, or if you, take into account the fact that multiple people said Hunter S. Thompson was kind of involved in this type of stuff. In late 2025, the whole Gannon Gate thing happens. On February 8th, Jeff Gannon resigned from the newspaper, and pretty much after that, he just kind of disappeared. I'll mention that in a bit, what happened with him, but really there's nothing that happened with him. He pretty much just vanished off the face of the earth. But then on February 20th, so just a few weeks after the whole Gannon Gate thing broke wide open and people were talking about, was this actually Johnny Gosch? On February 20th, 2005, Hunter S. Thompson killed himself. If you look into this, it's a really bizarre case. Supposedly he was on the phone with his wife and then he picked up a gun and shot himself, but she claims she never heard a gunshot, so that doesn't make much sense. After he died, this lady who used to be his former personal assistant, Nicole Brown was her name, she kind of wrote this little memoir of like her experiences working with him. She says, "Another time he threw me out of the house for refusing to watch a snuff film." So that's awesome. Hunter S. Thompson did have this quote the night before his death. He told a good friend of mine, or a good friend of his, I guess he was pretty paranoid towards the end, and he told a friend the night before his death, "They're going to make it look like a suicide. I know how those bastards think." So again, like the question is, well, who are those bastards and why did they want him dead? Was it tied into this whole resurfacing of the Johnny Gosch, disappearance and the whole child, pornography ring? And then another interesting note here is that not only did Hunter S. Thompson kill himself, or quote unquote kill himself around this time, but this guy Rusty Nelson, who was the personal photographer for Larry King, right after that, the search warrant was enacted for his house, and they confiscated his photographic equipment, computers, and photos, and he basically went on the run and just turned into this total hermit, and no one could find him. He was extremely paranoid about what might happen next. He always claimed that he was never involved in any of the horrible stuff that was going on. He claimed he would not be involved in any fact. He kind of thought that he was being set up to be like a fall guy in case like this whole thing really did blow up, that Larry King and some of the people around him were kind of setting this Rusty Nelson guy up to be the one they would blame on everything, maybe like by planting, pictures or things like that. But he became, back in the 80s when the whole Franklin scandal was happening, he was pretty paranoid, and he talks about it, that, he was being set up to be the fall guy. So it's certainly interesting how, the Gannon Gate thing, Hunter S. Thompson, this Rusty Nelson arrest, all this stuff just started happening all at once. to recap and kind of wrap things up, it's just the whole thing is very strange. Individually, really, all three of these stories are just insane stories. The disappearance of Johnny Gosch, there's so many layers to that in 1982, and the fact that he's never been found. Obviously, the Franklin scandal, like that is just a massive, massive, horrible, horrible story. There's so much more to it than what I covered in this video. And then this whole Jeff Gannon, Johnny Gosch thing, like, really is just such a bizarre thing. And it is weird how, Jeff Gannon is kind of fallen off the face of the earth. He supposedly, I think it was 2007, he supposedly published a book, but he's never really resurfaced since this whole thing broke in 2005. He's just kind of fallen off the face of the earth. So anyway, this whole story is definitely very strange. Definitely got a lot of really dark, disturbing aspects to it. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you soon with another one.